Cut! What an incredible scene, I sneered, my voice dripping with venomous irony as I stood in the doorway of the dressing room. My hands clenched the frame so tightly that I could feel my nails dig into the soft wood. There they were, my husband, and her, the starlet, the young and oh-so-talented actress who had somehow, miraculously, landed the lead role in his latest movie. Their startled faces turned to me, a frozen tableau of guilt and fear. The room reeked of expensive perfume, mingling with the faint metallic tang of betrayal. Her blouse was disheveled, her makeup smudged just enough to tell me all I needed to know. And him? He looked caught, like a predator realizing too late he'd walked into a trap. "Darling," he stammered, adjusting his shirt as though that might somehow fix the situation. "This isn't what it looks like." I let out a bitter laugh, the kind that came from a place too raw, too real to suppress. "Really? Then what is it? Because from where I'm standing, it looks like my husband has been giving his starlet more than just acting lessons." The girl, no, she wasn't a girl. She was a woman, fully aware of what she was doing, tried to speak, but her voice wavered under the weight of my glare. I think I should go." "Oh, don't leave on my account," I said, my voice cutting like glass. "You're clearly so comfortable here. Why don't you stay? Let's have a little chat about your method acting techniques." Her cheeks flushed deep red, and she grabbed her bag, mumbling some excuse about needing to get back on set. She brushed past me, her shoulder barely grazing mine, but it felt like a slap. As the door slammed shut behind her, the silence in the room became deafening. It was just me and him now, the man I had built my life around, the man who had whispered promises of forever into my ear on our wedding night. "What the hell is wrong with you?" His voice rose, defensive and sharp, as if I were the one who had crossed a line. "Me?" I spat, taking a step closer. "What's wrong with me? You're asking me that after I walk in on this?" My hands gestured wildly at the rumpled couch, the empty wine glasses, the still warm betrayal hanging in the air. "How long, Daniel? How long has this been going on?" His silence spoke louder than any words could have. He looked away, running a hand through his perfectly styled hair, the way he always did when he was cornered. "Don't you dare shut down on me now." My voice cracked, and I hated myself for it, for showing even a hint of vulnerability to the man who had just torn my heart to shreds. "You owe me the truth." He sighed, a heavy, labored breath, and finally met my gaze. "It's not what you think." "Oh, don't you dare!" I snapped. "Do not insult my intelligence, Daniel. You think I don't see the way you've been looking at her? The way she suddenly became the lead in your movie, out of nowhere? You think I didn't notice when you started staying late on set? Or how your phone is suddenly off limits?" He flinched at that, confirming what I already knew. My stomach churned, a sick, twisting knot of anger and heartbreak. "It wasn't supposed to happen like this," he said quietly, as though that would make it any better. "Then how was it supposed to happen, Daniel? Were you planning to tell me after the premiere? Or maybe on our anniversary? A nice little side note over dinner. By the way, honey, I've been screwing my leading lady." His face twisted in frustration. "It's not like that." "Then tell me what it's like," I screamed, my voice echoing off the cold walls. "Tell me how long you've been lying to me, because I deserve to know the truth." He hesitated, and in that hesitation, I saw the answer. Weeks. Months. Maybe even longer. "You bastard," I whispered, the weight of it crashing down on me like a tidal wave. Tears welled up in my eyes, but I refused to let them fall. Not here. Not in front of him. "It didn't mean anything," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Didn't mean anything?" I repeated, the words tasting bitter on my tongue. "You destroyed us for something that didn't mean anything?" He opened his mouth to respond, but I didn't want to hear it. I couldn't. I turned on my heel and walked out of the room, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might shatter. As I stormed down the hallway, his voice called after me, weak and pleading. "Please, just let me explain." But there was nothing left to explain. I already knew the truth. This wasn't a moment of weakness or a one-time mistake. This was a pattern, a choice. a betrayal that had been happening right under my nose for far longer than I wanted to admit. And as the doors of the studio closed behind me, I realized something else. This was just the beginning. It began on a crisp autumn evening, the kind where the air feels electric, full of possibility. I had ducked into a bookstore to escape the cold, wandering through the aisles of poetry and philosophy when I felt a presence beside me. He was tall, with disheveled hair that looked as though he'd run his hands through it one too many times. His eyes sparkled with a kind of restless energy that seemed to fill the space between us. "Looking for inspiration, or just hiding from the weather?" he asked, a crooked smile playing on his lips. I laughed, caught off guard by the casual confidence of his approach. "A bit of both, I suppose, and you?" "Always looking for inspiration," he said, holding up a worn paperback on cinematography. "It's a habit of mine. I'm a director, or at least I'm trying to be one." That was Daniel. Bold, passionate, and utterly unafraid to claim a title he hadn't yet earned. There was something magnetic about him, something that made it impossible to look away. We spent hours talking that night, sitting in a corner of the bookstore as though the rest of the world didn't exist. He spoke about his dreams with an intensity that made me believe in them, even though I barely knew him. Our first date wasn't much by most standards, a walk in the park with coffee we could barely afford, but it was perfect. We wandered through the crisp leaves, talking about everything from favorite films to childhood memories. He told me about how he used to sneak into movie theaters as a kid, mesmerized by the magic of storytelling. I told him about my love of writing, how I dreamed of crafting stories that would touch people's hearts. We were two dreamers, drawn together by a shared belief that the world could be more, that we could be more. In those early days, our love felt invincible. Even when life threw obstacles our way, we faced them together. Daniel was still struggling to get his foot in the door as a director, taking odd jobs on small film sets and spending endless nights rewriting scripts that no one seemed interested in. I was working as a freelance editor, piecing together enough income to keep us afloat. Money was tight, but we made it work. Our apartment was tiny, with creaky floors and a radiator that only worked when it wanted to, but it was ours. We would stay up late, curled up on the couch, watching old films and dreaming of the future. "Someday," Daniel would say, his eyes fixed on the screen, "I'll make something like this, something that matters." "And I'll be right there with you," I'd reply, meaning every word. There were tough moments, of course, times when the rejection letters piled up and Daniel would come home defeated, questioning whether he was good enough. "What if I never make it?" he asked me once, his voice heavy with doubt. "You will," I told him, holding his face in my hands, "because you're too stubborn not to." I believed in him, even when he didn't believe in himself. I was his cheerleader, his confidant, the person who reminded him why he started when the world seemed determined to break him down. Our sacrifices were countless, but we never saw them that way. The nights we spent eating instant noodles because we couldn't afford anything else were just part of the adventure. The weekends we gave up to work on his projects were investments in our future. When he finally got his first real directing job, a low-budget indie film that barely paid, we celebrated like he'd won an Oscar. I'll never forget the way his face lit up when he got the call, the way he pulled me into his arms and whispered, "We did it." The film wasn't a massive success, but it opened doors. Slowly, Daniel started to make a name for himself. Each new project was a step forward, and with every step, I was there, cheering him on. There were magical moments too, moments that felt like scenes from a movie. Like the time he surprised me with a homemade dinner after his first big shoot, the candles flickering in our little kitchen as he thanked me for believing in him. Or the night we danced in the rain, laughing until our sides hurt because we couldn't afford tickets to the concert we'd wanted to see. Those were the moments that made everything else worth it. The struggle, the uncertainty, the endless waiting. They all felt like minor hurdles compared to the love we shared. Even as his career began to take off, I told myself nothing would change. Sure, he was busier now, with more people demanding his attention, but at the end of the day, he always came home to me. But looking back, I wonder if I was fooling myself. The signs were there, even then. The late nights, the way he started to retreat into his work, the moments when I felt like a supporting character in his story rather than a partner in our shared dream. At the time, I told myself it was temporary, that we were just adjusting to his success, that once things settled down, we'd find our way back to the simplicity we'd once had. I held on to the good memories, the times when we felt invincible, the way he used to look at me as though I were the only person in the world, the nights we spent dreaming of a future that felt just within reach. But now, those memories feel like fragments of a life that belonged to someone else, a life that slipped through my fingers while I wasn't paying attention. And the man I see now, the man who betrayed me, is nothing like the man I fell in love with. I wonder, was he always this person? Or did success change him? Did I change him? Or worse, did I just never see the truth? It started with a feeling, a small, nagging whisper in the back of my mind that I tried to ignore. At first, I chalked it up to my own insecurities, a symptom of the distance that had grown between us as Daniel's career began to soar. He was busier than ever, constantly on set or at meetings, his phone always buzzing with calls and texts from people I didn't know. But I told myself it was normal. This was what success looked like, wasn't it? The first time I felt the weight of doubt, it was over something as trivial as a text. We were having dinner at home, one of the rare evenings he wasn't working late. I had made his favorite pasta, hoping to recreate a slice of the life we used to have, but he seemed distracted, his eyes darting to his phone every few minutes. "Everything okay?" I asked, trying to keep my tone light. "Yeah, just work stuff," he replied, not meeting my gaze as he typed out a reply. I wanted to believe him, so I didn't push. But that night, as he slept beside me, his phone buzzed again. I glanced at the screen, and for a brief moment, I saw her name. It was just a first name, something generic, forgettable, but it was enough to make my stomach twist. The next morning, I asked him about it casually, pretending I wasn't already spiraling. "Who's Sophia?" "Oh, she's the new actress on set," he said, barely looking up from his coffee. "She's playing the lead in the new film. Really talented." He said it so nonchalantly, as if there was nothing to hide. And maybe there wasn't. Maybe I was overthinking it. But the way he said her name, it lingered in the air, too soft, too familiar. After that, the doubts became harder to ignore. It wasn't just the texts or the late nights. It was the way he started pulling away, the way his once effortless affection now felt rehearsed. He used to kiss me goodbye every morning, a small but meaningful ritual that made me feel seen. Now, his kisses were hurried, distracted, like an afterthought. I noticed how he would light up when he talked about work, not just the projects, but the people. He mentioned her more often, always in passing, always with that same subtle warmth. "Sophia's really coming into her own in this role," he'd say. Or, "Sophia had this great idea for a scene today." Every mention felt like a stone dropped into my chest, but I didn't know how to confront it without sounding paranoid. So I told myself it was nothing, just a professional relationship, nothing more. But then there were the missed calls, the canceled plans, the excuses that didn't quite add up. He started coming home later and later, blaming long shoots or last-minute edits. One night, I waited up for him, staring at the clock as midnight turned to 1, then 2. When he finally walked through the door, his shirt slightly rumpled and his hair messier than usual, he muttered something about an extended meeting with the producers. "Do producers usually wear Chanel No. 5? I asked, my voice sharper than I intended. He froze, caught off guard, before brushing past me with a forced laugh. "You're imagining things." But I wasn't. I knew that scent. It was too distinct, too expensive to mistake, and I knew it wasn't mine. The following weeks were a blur of unease. Every time he left the house, I found myself wondering where he was really going, who he was really with. I hated feeling that way, distrustful, suspicious, like some jealous caricature of myself. But the signs were piling up, and no matter how hard I tried to ignore them, they refused to be silenced. One afternoon, while he was in the shower, I did something I swore I'd never do. I picked up his phone. My hands were shaking so badly I almost dropped it. I told myself I was just being paranoid, that I wouldn't find anything, but deep down, I already knew the truth. There were texts, dozens of them, messages exchanged at all hours of the day and night. Her name was there, over and over again, along with phrases that made my heart shatter. Can't wait to see you tonight. Last night was amazing. You make everything better. I couldn't breathe. My hands felt cold, numb as I stared at the screen. I wanted to throw the phone across the room, to scream, to confront him right then and there. But instead, I put it back where I found it, quietly slipping out of the bathroom before he could notice. I spent the rest of the day convincing myself I was wrong. Maybe it wasn't what it looked like. Maybe I was overreacting. Maybe it was just a misunderstanding. But the evidence kept piling up. A receipt for an expensive dinner I didn't attend. A scarf in his car that wasn't mine. The way he suddenly became protective of his phone, keeping it face down on the table and taking it with him everywhere, even to the bathroom. I knew. I had known for a long time, even before I saw those texts. But knowing and accepting are two very different things. So I told myself lies. I told myself he was just stressed, that he still loved me, that this was just a phase. I clung to the memories of who we used to be, of the life we had built together, because the alternative was too painful to face. But deep down, I knew. I knew I was holding on to a man who was already gone. And no matter how tightly I gripped the fragments of our marriage, they were slipping through my fingers like sand. I had spent the last week in a haze, barely eating, barely sleeping. The walls of our once shared apartment seemed to close in on me, suffocating me with memories of what we used to be. The smell of his cologne lingered in the air, a cruel reminder of a life that had shattered into a million pieces. I'd lie on the couch, staring at the ceiling, replaying every moment, every word, every lie. I thought the pain would consume me entirely, that I'd never feel whole again. But somewhere in the depths of that despair, a tiny spark ignited, a quiet voice urging me to move, to breathe, to live. That's what led me to the park. It was a place I used to go when life felt overwhelming, a little haven tucked away from the noise of the city. The path wound through towering trees, their branches arching overhead like a cathedral of nature. At the heart of it all was a hidden alcove, a small clearing with a bench overlooking a quiet pond. It had always been my sanctuary, a place where I could think, where the world seemed to pause for just a moment. As I stepped into the clearing, the crisp air filled my lungs, carrying with it the faint scent of pine and damp earth. The golden light of the late afternoon filtered through the trees, casting dappled patterns on the ground. For the first time in weeks, I felt a flicker of peace. I made my way to the bench and sat down, letting the stillness wrap around me. The water of the pond shimmered like glass, and I stared into its depths, losing myself in the ripples. And then I heard a voice. "It's beautiful, isn't it?" I turned, startled, to see a man standing a few feet away. He was tall, with dark, tousled hair and piercing eyes that seemed to see right through me. He was dressed simply, dark jeans and a gray sweater, but there was an effortless elegance to him, a quiet confidence that made it hard to look away. "Sorry," he said, taking a step closer. "I didn't mean to startle you. I come here often, and I've never seen anyone else here before." "It's fine," I managed, my voice quieter than I intended. "I didn't think anyone else knew about this place." He smiled, a small, almost melancholic curve of his lips. "It's easy to miss. That's what makes it special." For a moment, neither of us spoke. He seemed content to stand there, his hands in his pockets, while I sat, unsure of whether to stay or go. But there was something disarming about him, something that made me want to linger. "Rough day?" he asked gently, tilting his head as he studied me. I let out a bitter laugh, the sound surprising even me. "You could say that." He didn't press, didn't ask for details. Instead, he moved to the other side of the bench, leaving a respectful distance between us, and sat down. Sometimes it helps to just sit. Let the world exist without you for a while. I glanced at him, trying to gauge his intentions. He didn't seem like the kind of man who stumbled into places like this by accident. There was a calmness about him, a steady presence that made me feel oddly safe, even though I didn't know him. We sat in silence for a while, the sounds of the park filling the space between us, the rustling leaves, the soft chirping of birds, the occasional ripple of water as a fish surfaced. For the first time in what felt like forever, my mind quieted. "Do you come here often?" I asked eventually, surprising myself with the question. He nodded. Whenever I need to think. It's the kind of place that reminds you how small you are, in the best way. Puts things into perspective. I hesitated, unsure of how much to reveal. But there was something about him, something unspoken yet trustworthy, that made me want to speak. I used to come here all the time, I said, but it's been a while. He turned to look at me, his gaze steady but not intrusive. Something keeping you away? I swallowed hard, the weight of everything threatening to resurface. Life, I guess. Things got complicated. His expression softened, as though he understood more than he let on. Complicated has a way of finding us, doesn't it? I nodded, my throat tightening. For a moment, I thought I might break down, right there in front of a stranger. But then he spoke again, his voice calm and steady. Sometimes complicated is just the prelude to clarity, he said. The trick is to keep moving forward, even when it feels impossible. His words hung in the air, settling into the cracks of my broken heart. I didn't know what to say, so I simply nodded, letting his presence fill the silence. After a while, he stood, brushing off his jeans. I should get going, he said, his tone gentle. But it was nice to meet you. You too, I replied, my voice softer than I intended. As he turned to leave, I found myself calling after him. Wait! He paused, glancing back at me with a curious look. What's your name? I asked. Ethan, he said, a small smile playing on his lips. And you? I hesitated for a moment before answering. Sophia. His smile widened, just a fraction, and then he nodded. See you around, Sophia. I watched as he disappeared down the path, his figure fading into the shadows of the trees. For the first time in weeks, the ache in my chest felt a little lighter. I didn't know who Ethan was or why he'd appeared in my life at that moment, but somehow his words stayed with me. Maybe, just maybe, he was right. Maybe this wasn't the end. Maybe it was just the beginning. The days began to blur into one another, but the evenings held a quiet kind of magic. It wasn't something we planned. Ethan and I never spoke of when we'd meet again, yet we always seemed to find each other in that secluded corner of the park. It became an unspoken ritual, as natural as the sun setting and the stars appearing in the night sky. At first, our meetings were simple. We'd sit on the bench, exchanging small talk or falling into comfortable silences. He had a way of listening that made me feel like my words mattered, like the weight I carried wasn't too much for him to bear. For the first time in what felt like forever, I didn't feel invisible. One evening, as the golden light of dusk painted the park in warm hues, Ethan broke the silence. You know, he began, his voice tinged with curiosity. We keep meeting here like this, but I barely know anything about you. I smiled, looking down at my hands. What do you want to know? Anything you're willing to share, he said, leaning back against the bench. I have a feeling there's a lot more to you than what you let on. I hesitated, the familiar walls rising around me. But then I looked at him, his expression open and patient, and I felt a flicker of courage. I'm a writer, I said finally. Or at least, I used to be. I haven't written much lately. Why not? He asked, genuinely curious. I shrugged, the weight of the truth pressing against my chest. Life got in the way, I guess. Or maybe I just lost the part of me that loved it. He studied me for a moment, his gaze steady. I don't think you lost it. I think it's still there, waiting for you to find it again. His words caught me off guard, striking a chord deep within me. I didn't know how to respond, so I changed the subject. What about you? What's your story? Ethan smiled, a faint shadow crossing his face. I'm a photographer. I used to travel a lot for work, but I've been taking it slow lately, trying to figure out what's next. Do you miss it? I asked. Sometimes, he admitted. But there's something nice about staying in one place for a while. It gives you time to think, to reflect. We continued to talk, peeling back the layers of each other's lives bit by bit. I told him about my love for books, about the dreams I once had of publishing my own stories. He shared tales of his travels, of the people and places that had left a mark on him. Over time, our meetings grew longer, stretching from twilight into the cool darkness of night. It felt easy, natural, like we had known each other for years instead of weeks. One evening, as we sat on the bench under a canopy of stars, Ethan turned to me with a small, hesitant smile. You know, it's funny. For two people who seem to cross paths so easily, we've never exchanged numbers. I laughed softly, realizing he was right. Maybe we didn't need to. We always seemed to find each other anyway. True, he said, his smile widening. But just in case one of us gets lost. He pulled out his phone, and for a moment, I hesitated. This was the first step towards something more, something that existed beyond the quiet sanctuary of the park. But as I looked at him, his eyes warm and kind, I knew I wanted to take that step. We exchanged numbers, the simple act feeling oddly significant. For the first time in weeks, I felt a spark of excitement, a sense of possibility. It wasn't long before our connection expanded beyond the park. Ethan suggested meeting for coffee, and I agreed, nervous but eager. We discovered a quaint little cafe tucked into a corner of the neighborhood, its walls lined with books and its tables lit by soft, flickering candles. We talked for hours, losing track of time as the world outside faded into irrelevance. I learned that he loved jazz music, that he had a soft spot for old black and white films, and that he hated olives with a passion. He learned about my favorite authors, my obsession with sunflowers, and my inexplicable fear of thunderstorms. As we walked home that night, he stopped suddenly, glancing at the building we were passing. "Wait a second," he said, a playful smile tugging at his lips. "Do you live here?" I blinked, confused. "Yeah, why?" "Because I live there," he said, pointing to the neighboring high-rise. We both laughed, the coincidence too perfect to believe. "I guess we were bound to run into each other eventually," I said. "Fate has a funny way of working, doesn't it?" He replied, his tone light but his eyes serious. From that moment on, we became part of each other's routines. We'd meet for morning coffee or take evening walks through the neighborhood. Sometimes we'd sit on the steps of our buildings, talking late into the night. Ethan became a steady presence in my life, a quiet source of comfort and joy. He didn't press me to share more than I was ready to, but he listened intently to everything I did say. For the first time in a long time, I felt like I could breathe. The ache in my chest began to dull, replaced by a warmth I hadn't realized I was capable of feeling again. But even as I grew closer to Ethan, a part of me hesitated. The wounds Daniel had left were still fresh, and I wasn't sure if I was ready to let someone in completely. Still, Ethan's patience and kindness gave me hope, a hope I hadn't dared to believe in before. As I looked out at the city lights from my apartment one evening, my phone buzzed with a message from him. "Same time tomorrow?" I smiled, typing back a quick reply. "Wouldn't miss it." The evening had been perfect. Ethan and I were in his living room, sharing a bottle of wine and laughing about something trivial, one of those moments that felt so light, so effortless. It was the kind of evening I hadn't realized I'd been missing for so long. But the tranquility was shattered in an instant. A loud, violent pounding erupted from the door, startling us both. My heart jumped into my throat as the pounding grew louder, more urgent, accompanied by a voice I knew all too well. "Open the door, you wretch! Right now!" Daniel's voice roared through the hallway, thick with rage and something darker I couldn't quite place. I froze, my blood running cold. My hands trembled as I looked at Ethan, whose eyes were already narrowed in concern. "Who is that?" he asked, his voice steady but low. "It's him," I whispered, barely able to get the words out. "It's Daniel." Ethan's expression darkened, but before he could say anything, another round of violent banging shook the door. "Open up, Sophia! I know you're in there!" Daniel's voice was wild now, laced with desperation and fury. I stood, my knees weak, as Ethan rose beside me. "Stay here," he said firmly, already moving toward the door. "No," I said quickly, grabbing his arm. "You don't understand. He's dangerous." Ethan's jaw tightened, but he nodded, staying close to me as we approached the door. Daniel's shouting grew louder, the words cutting like shards of glass. "You think you can ruin my life and get away with it, huh? You think you can humiliate me and just move on like nothing happened? Open this door!" My breath hitched, panic clawing at my chest. I had no doubt he knew about Ethan now, and the thought of him hurting anyone, especially Ethan, was unbearable. "Call the police," Ethan said quietly, his voice calm despite the tension in his shoulders. I nodded and turned to grab my phone, but before I could, the door rattled violently as Daniel began trying to force it open. "Don't make me break this door down, Sophia," he screamed. And then, with a deafening crash, the door slammed open. Daniel stood in the doorway, his face twisted in rage. His normally polished appearance was disheveled, his hair messy, and his eyes wild. He reeked of alcohol, the smell wafting into the apartment as he staggered inside. "There you are," he spat, his eyes locking on me like a predator spotting its prey. "You ruined everything, you know that? You destroyed my reputation, my career." "Daniel, you need to leave," I said, trying to keep my voice steady even as my knees threatened to buckle. He laughed, a cold, humorless sound. "Leave? Oh no, sweetheart, I'm not going anywhere. Not until you understand exactly what you've done to me." "Enough," Ethan said, stepping between us. "You need to leave, now." Daniel's gaze shifted to Ethan, his lip curling in disdain. "And who the hell are you? Her little replacement? Is this the guy, Sophia? The one you've been screwing while you ruined my life?" "Stop it, Daniel," I said, my voice shaking. "Just leave. This isn't going to end well for you." "End well?" he sneered, his eyes narrowing. "You think you can threaten me? After everything I've done for you? After everything I built for us? You're nothing without me, Sophia. Nothing!" The words hit like a slap, but before I could respond, Daniel's hand moved to his jacket. My heart stopped as he pulled out a gun, the metallic glint catching the light. "Daniel!" I screamed, my voice raw with terror. "Shut up!" he barked, waving the gun wildly. "You think I'm bluffing? You think I won't do it?" Ethan stepped forward, his hands raised. "Calm down. Put the gun down, Daniel. You don't want to do this." But Daniel was beyond reason. "You think you can play the hero?" he snarled, his voice trembling with rage. "You don't know what she's like. She's a liar, a manipulator. She's the one who ruined everything." Before anyone could react, he pointed the gun at the ceiling and pulled the trigger. The deafening crack of the shot echoed through the apartment, and I screamed, covering my ears as plaster rained down. The sound seemed to snap Ethan into action. With a speed I didn't know he had, he lunged at Daniel, grabbing his wrist and twisting it until the gun clattered to the floor. Daniel shouted in pain, struggling against Ethan's grip, but Ethan didn't let up. "Call the police!" Ethan shouted over his shoulder, his voice sharp and commanding. I fumbled for my phone, my hands shaking so badly I almost dropped it. I dialed the number, my voice barely audible as I explained the situation to the operator. Meanwhile, Ethan wrestled Daniel to the ground, pinning him with a strength that surprised even me. Daniel thrashed and cursed, but Ethan held firm, his jaw set in determination. Minutes felt like hours, but eventually the sound of sirens filled the air. Relief washed over me as the police burst into the apartment, their weapons drawn. Ethan stepped back as the officers restrained Daniel, who continued to shout obscenities even as they hauled him to his feet. "You'll regret this, Sophia," he screamed as they led him away. "You think this is over? It's not over!" The door slammed shut behind him, and the apartment fell into an eerie silence. I sank to the floor, my hands trembling as the weight of what had just happened crashed over me. Ethan was by my side in an instant, his arms wrapping around me. "It's over," he said softly, his voice steady despite everything. "You're safe now." But as I clung to him, my heart still racing, I couldn't help but wonder if Daniel was right. Was it truly over? Or was this just the beginning of something even darker? The days following the incident felt like a blur of questions, statements, and an overwhelming sense of disbelief. The police had taken Daniel into custody that night, and for the first time in what felt like forever, I could finally breathe again, though the weight of what had happened lingered heavily on my chest. Ethan stayed by my side through it all, his presence a steady anchor as I navigated the chaos. He came with me to the police station when they called me in to give my official statement, sitting silently in the waiting area with a quiet, unwavering support that spoke volumes. When I stumbled over my words, my emotions threatening to overwhelm me, he would gently place a hand on my knee or meet my eyes with a reassuring nod, grounding me. the case against Daniel moved quickly. The evidence was damning. The illegal possession of a firearm, the threat of violence, the property damage, and the assault on Ethan. Witness accounts from neighbors who heard the commotion and the gunshot only solidified the charges. Within weeks, Daniel was officially charged with multiple counts, including harassment and unlawful discharge of a weapon. The judge denied him bail, citing his erratic behavior and clear danger to others. When I received the news of his sentencing, 2 years in prison with a mandatory restraining order against me and Ethan, I didn't feel the relief I thought I would. Instead, I felt a strange mix of emotions: anger, sadness, and an ache for the life I had once shared with someone who had become a stranger. It was a painful reminder of how much I had lost, but also how far I had come. Ethan was my rock throughout it all. He never once pushed me to move faster than I was ready, but he was always there, quietly reminding me that I wasn't alone. He insisted on staying close, often spending nights at my apartment or inviting me to his, just to ensure I felt safe. One night, as we sat on his couch, the warmth of the fire casting soft shadows on the walls, he broke the silence. "How are you really feeling?" he asked, his voice low and careful. I hesitated, unsure how to articulate the jumble of emotions inside me. "I don't know," I admitted finally. "Part of me feels relieved, like I can finally move on. But another part of me feels broken, like I'm still carrying all of it with me." Ethan reached for my hand, his fingers curling around mine. "It's okay to feel that way. What you went through, it's not something you just forget, but you don't have to carry it alone anymore." His words hit me harder than I expected, and before I knew it, the tears started to fall. Ethan didn't say anything, didn't try to fill the silence with empty reassurances. He simply pulled me into his arms, holding me as I cried, his hand gently stroking my hair. "You're safe now," he whispered, his voice steady, "and I'll do whatever it takes to keep it that way." Over the weeks that followed, Ethan and I grew closer in ways I hadn't thought possible. He didn't just offer me comfort, he helped me find strength within myself. We spent hours talking, really talking, about everything and nothing. I told him about the parts of my past I had kept hidden, and he shared pieces of himself that felt like gifts. We started building a life together, slowly but intentionally. Little things, like cooking dinner or decorating his apartment with photos we'd taken on walks, became moments of quiet joy. But it wasn't all easy. There were nights when I woke up shaking from nightmares, Daniel's voice still echoing in my mind. Ethan would wake too, pulling me close and whispering soothing words until I drifted back to sleep. "I'm here," he'd say, over and over, as if repeating it could make it more real. And somehow, it always worked. Through it all, Ethan's patience never wavered. He gave me the space to heal, but was always there when I needed him. Slowly, the fear began to fade, replaced by a sense of safety I hadn't felt in years. One evening, as we sat on the balcony of his apartment, watching the city lights twinkle in the distance, I turned to him. "Ethan," I said softly, my voice barely above a whisper. "Thank you for everything." He smiled, that same warm, steady smile that had become my favorite thing in the world. "You don't have to thank me," he said. "Being with you, it's not something I have to do. It's something I want to do, every single day." My heart swelled at his words, and for the first time in what felt like forever, I let myself believe in the possibility of a future. Not just any future, but one where I could truly be happy. As the months passed, our bond only deepened. The scars of the past didn't disappear, but they became easier to bear, softened by the love and trust we had built together. And in Ethan's arms, I found something I thought I had lost forever: hope. Hope for a life free of fear, a life filled with love, and a future that was ours to create, together. The day Daniel was officially sentenced marked a turning point in my life. It wasn't just about justice being served, it was the closure I had desperately needed. For the first time in what felt like an eternity, the shadow he had cast over me began to lift. I walked out of the courthouse with Ethan by my side, the cool breeze on my face feeling like a fresh start. "You did it," Ethan said softly, his hand brushing against mine as we walked. "No, I replied, looking up at him. We did it. He smiled at me, his eyes filled with pride and something deeper, something that made me feel like I had finally found my place in the world. In the weeks that followed, life began to take on a new rhythm, one that felt lighter and freer. Ethan and I continued to grow closer, our days filled with small, meaningful moments that reminded me of what happiness truly felt like. There was the time we redecorated my apartment, turning it from a place of painful memories into a sanctuary of warmth and love. We painted the walls a soft, calming shade of blue and filled the shelves with books and photos. Ethan even hung up a few of his favorite photographs, scenes from his travels that brought the world into our little corner of it. Then there were the mornings spent sipping coffee on the balcony, the sunlight warming our skin as we talked about everything and nothing. Or the quiet nights when we'd curl up on the couch, sharing a blanket as we watched old movies. It wasn't just about the big gestures or grand declarations. It was the way Ethan made me laugh when I felt like crying, the way he listened when I needed to talk, the way he simply showed up every single day. One evening, as we walked through the park where we'd first met, Ethan stopped suddenly. "What's wrong?" I asked, tilting my head to look at him. "Nothing," he said with a smile. I want to remember this moment." I laughed softly, my heart swelling at the way he could make even the simplest moments feel significant. "You're such a romantic," I teased, though the warmth in my voice betrayed how much I loved it. "Guilty as charged," he replied, taking my hand in his. As the days turned into months, we began to talk about the future, not in vague, abstract terms, but in real, tangible ways. We talked about where we wanted to live, the trips we wanted to take, the life we wanted to build together. For the first time in a long time, I felt like I could truly see a future for myself, one that wasn't defined by fear or pain. And it wasn't just because of Ethan, it was because of the strength I had found within myself. But Ethan had been a big part of that journey, and one evening, as we sat on the couch with the soft glow of the city lights behind us, I turned to him. "Ethan," I began, my voice trembling slightly. He looked at me, his expression soft and patient. "Yeah?" I want you to know how much you've changed my life," I said, the words spilling out in a rush. "You've shown me what it means to feel safe, to feel loved, and I don't think I could ever thank you enough for that." "You don't have to thank me," he replied, his voice steady. "You've given me just as much, more, even." And in that moment, I knew without a doubt that this was where I was meant to be, with him in a life we had built together, full of love and possibility. Looking back on everything that happened, it feels like I've lived 100 different lives. There was the life I had with Daniel, full of dreams and promises that eventually crumbled under the weight of betrayal. There was the life after him, filled with pain, doubt, and the slow, painstaking process of finding myself again. And now, there's this life, the one I never expected, but the one I wouldn't trade for anything. Ethan didn't save me, not in the way stories usually go. He didn't swoop in and fix everything or erase the scars of my past. What he did was far more important. He gave me the space to heal, the patience to grow, and the unwavering belief that I could find my way back to myself. There are still moments when the past creeps in, when I hear Daniel's voice in my head or feel the shadow of his actions looming over me. But those moments don't define me anymore. They're just echoes, reminders of how far I've come. I've learned that healing isn't about forgetting or pretending the pain never existed. It's about taking that pain and turning it into something meaningful. It's about finding strength in vulnerability and allowing yourself to be loved, even when it feels scary. Ethan and I still visit the park sometimes, sitting on the same bench where our story began. And every time, I'm reminded of how far we've come, of how a chance meeting in a quiet corner of the world led to something so much bigger. This isn't the end of the story. It's just the beginning of a new chapter. And for the first time in my life, I'm excited to see what comes next. Because I'm not just surviving anymore. I'm living. And that's a gift I'll never take for granted.